Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is commitment and consistency, which I talked about yesterday on the Hackney Marshes in the open air, which was lovely. Today I'm going to attempt to do it without all of that noise, the wind noise, and I'm going to try and do it from memory without looking at an outline. I'm just using this as a way of exploring the ideas around commitment and consistency, and they might come structured in a different way. I might go back to having a little paper in my palm of my hand when I talk about it, but we'll see. Anyway, so just to kind of talk about where we are in the structure of the book. So the introduction of the book basically says point of view is worth 80 IQ points. If you look at things in a helpful way, you can be much cleverer about them, like genius level. If you look at things in a less helpful way, you can be less smart about things, and it can turn you into an idiot. And so then the first 5 or 6 chapters of the book are talking about useful ways of looking at projects, helpful ways of looking at projects, which make you smarter in the way that you manage projects. And then this is the transition, and maybe that's why I'm kind of having so much difficulty with it. This is the transition from talking about helpful ways of looking at projects to unhelpful ways. And I think part of the reason that this is so difficult is because I have a lot of experience of people looking at projects in unhelpful ways and essentially battling those ways that people look at projects. One of the things I realized about these chapters where I talk about unhelpful ways of looking at things, is that you have to kind of offer some explanation and some evidence that people will look at things in these kinds of ways. So why would people look at things in terms of keeping promises and commitment and consistency? I'm gonna use both of those terms. Keeping promises because I think that is the basic idea, the kind of basic way of looking at projects. Looking at projects is basically honouring a promise, which is problematic. And commitment and consistency because that is the label that is given by the people that I've read about in psychology. I've read their discussions of this, to this kind of powerful human drive to basically keep your word and be consistent about what you do with the things that you say. So why might people be tempted to think about managing projects in terms of commitment and consistency? Well, one of the reasons is that this is traditionally how projects have been managed. In the kind of back history of software development and project management as software development, there is this idea of waterfall project management, which is basically collecting together a bunch of high-level requirements and then agreeing them as the thing that was going to be delivered over a long period of time. So this kind of idea, this model of collecting together a bunch of requirements and then promising them effectively, very often promising them for a particular time and for a particular cost. This is what a lot of people think project management is, and so there is a kind of battle there when you're kind of trying to manage projects in a different way, of trying to get out of that. Another thing I think that we have to be absolutely blunt about is that this is pretty much always the way that projects are purchased, certainly when the relationship between the people who want the project and the people who are going to deliver the project is a new, untested relationship. There is this view that this kind of contract-based, you're going to deliver this list of things by a certain date for a certain amount of money. That's a kind of safe way of kind of managing the costs and the procurement of software development. And I think one thing that it's just crossed my mind as I'm talking about this is very much the way that procurement departments want to procure things. They don't want to procure open-ended things where there's kind of uncertainty about what's going to be delivered and how much it's going to cost. So there's a lot of pressure at the beginning of projects to have something that is structured in this way of, here's a list of things and we're going to deliver it by a certain time for a certain cost, even though you see lots and lots of discussion. I'm just going to lower the camera, not myself. You see lots of discussion in Agile about this thing called the iron triangle, which is a project, the idea of a project being fixed cost, fixed time, fixed scope, and how that is a problem, and somehow we try and dispense with that in Agile. There's a lot of kind of law, practice, and kind of confidence in this kind of structure, in this kind of fixed price, fixed scope, fixed time structure. And my experience is that kind of certainly when you're working with a client for the first time, nothing will really happen. There'll not be any kind of agreement to progress with a project until something like a fixed price, fixed cost, fixed scope project has been agreed. And so those are the kind of reasons why people might want to do that. I think there's a third reason that we'll talk about. I don't know how many reasons I've mentioned. There's another reason that we might mention in a minute, because what I want to kind of talk about in relation to this now is like, so those are the reasons why people might want to have a kind of fixed promise style, commitment style way of starting a project. And I totally understand that, especially if the people who are doing this are unfamiliar with any of the other approaches to kind of more successful approaches to kind of delivering software. And so then kind of like, having said why people might want to do this, the kind of next thing is to kind of say, well, why is this problematic? And one of the reasons I think it's problematic is because if you imagine the thing that I was talking about the commitment and consistency, well, what are the kinds of things that are best in terms of what's a good commitment? What's a good way of being consistent about something? It's when you make the commitment, you know that you can deliver on that commitment, and that commitment is consistent with other things that you're thinking. So that's a good commitment. And I suppose, like, if you think about the two ends of this commitment, what's even better is if the person who's receiving that commitment what's even better is if the person who's receiving that commitment is also comfortable that you can do it, and comfortable that you will actually do it, that it's consistent with what they believe, right? But part of the problem with commitment and consistency is because it's so powerful, and this is the thing that Robert Cialdini writes about in his book Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion. He talks about this is one of the 6 powerful human motivators that can end up being manipulated by people like sales professionals, politicians, other kinds of people who want to influence and manipulate you. Because this is so powerful, because commitment and consistency is such a powerful idea, people know that they can muck about with it and use it to get people to commit to things that they don't want to do, that they're not comfortable with, that they're not entirely certain they can do, and that aren't consistent with other things that they're thinking and other things that they believe. And this is absolutely, unfortunately, one of the things that happens when people are procuring IT projects. One of the examples that's haunting me just recently that I saw was I was involved in the preparation of a bid for a large organisation, and the bids were going to be scored. Various companies were bidding for this work. And this organisation, in the bid, it said, we will give you extra points in your bid. Your bid will perform score more highly if you can promise that you can deliver it for the end of the financial year. Now, when you read through the description of this bid, it was obvious that there were huge areas that were extremely uncertain, that would need negotiation. And also, when you read through what was actually supposed to be delivered, that was extremely vague. Forgetting the fact that there were these inherent areas of uncertainty where you didn't know what was going on. What was the commitment to be delivered? That was also kind of vague as well. And so, essentially what they were asking for in this bid is, they're saying, you tell us that you can certainly deliver this for a particular date, because it was pretty obvious that people who didn't do that weren't going to win, even though there are these areas of uncertainty in the bid. Is that honest? How far away from that kind of ideal kind of commitment that I've just been talking about is this? I think it's quite a long way away from this ideal commitment, because essentially the people who are asking you for the commitment are asking you to commit to something that they must know is not possible. And so then when you commit to it, you're also committing to something that you know is not possible. So you're in this situation where both of you know that what's being said isn't possible. Now, why would anybody want to do that? I think the clue in this particular case is the end of the financial year, because I think there is some kind of argument that they're going to put to some other group that says, oh, we can do this, it'll all be done and dusted by the end of the year. And that's for funding, so this is a procurement thing again. I think there might also be some other kind of... there's a pattern that I've seen, I think like in Agile we'd call it an anti-pattern, of people trying to maneuver their suppliers into a situation where they've promised something that everybody knows can't be delivered, as a way of essentially exploiting the supplier. Because once they're in a situation where they can't deliver the thing that they've promised, they're kind of on the back foot, and then it makes it very difficult for them to say no to anything else. So that the people who are writing this proposal know that the scope is extremely vague, and they maybe know that there isn't going to be any more money for large creep in scope that is going to be revealed. And so this is kind of a strategy for putting the suppliers on the back foot. Are you starting to see why I think that commitment and consistency is not necessarily the most helpful approach to managing projects? And this is before we touch on something that I talked about in the last chapter, which is the fact that everything in project management is a bet. Everything is inherently risky. Everything is inherently uncertain. And so then if that's the case, if you go back to this kind of this perfect commitment, in a perfect commitment, there wouldn't be any uncertainty. In the kind of commitments that you're being asked to make in projects, in any kind of projects, there is inherent uncertainty. And so this makes making commitments for projects, I think, it's kind of inherently irrational and very often dishonest. And this causes a big problem for projects, because this kind of inherent dishonesty is where you start. This is the starting position that you have in most projects, is that you've got one bunch of people who are saying that they're going to do something that they know they can't really do, and another bunch of people who've maneuvered them into saying that they're going to do something that they can't do. So both sides knowing that this is not really what's going on. I think maybe a kind of more grown up and less emotional and kind of more sympathetic way of seeing this from both sides is, look, these are just negotiating positions. These are just kind of going in positions in something that is going to be a negotiation. And that's kind of what I talked about when I was talking about the stress and strains between the idea value stream and the actual product value stream. What I said there was like basically a lot of the skills that you're going to need there are negotiation skills, because you have to essentially negotiate between the idea and the reality. And this is kind of like focusing again on that kind of that initial dip after a project starts, where you are going to start. One of the things that happens in that part of a project is you start to find out a lot of the issues with the project. Whether it's we can't talk to the people who would actually tell us how this thing should work. Sometimes we're legally prevented from talking to those people, or they don't want to talk to us, or the technology that's been suggested that could do this can't do it, or the progress that we're making indicates that this project is going to take a factor of N longer than was initially discussed. All those kinds of things that are typical things that you find right at the beginning of a project. Now, my point about the commitment and consistency and the idea of a contract and a promise is that it's going to make it harder to bring these things up in that kind of initial phase. The fact that you have this kind of contract, it's going to make it more difficult to kind of say, well, I know the contract says this, but the minute we started to do this, we found this, and this, and this. And this is a kind of crucial stage in any project. And moving on to kind of what you can do about problems with commitment and consistency. What you have to realize is what you're trying to do is essentially do all of the agile good stuff. So customer collaboration instead of contract negotiation. You have to kind of build some kind of relationship with the customer. And the hardest point to do that is going to be immediately after you start the project. You have to build some kind of trust with them. So that trust is about basically saying, look, this is what we've discovered. This is going to have this effect on what we've promised to deliver. What do you want to do about that? And then getting through kind of various negotiation positions, which are kind of the flavour of, well, we expect you to swallow all of that cost because you promised this, and getting to a point where the people that you are working for, the people that you're delivering the software for, actually do trust that when you say these things, you're telling the truth. So it's very important that you do tell the truth. The other things are other agile good stuff, working software over detailed documentation. So I've talked about this all through the book, and I'll continue to talk about it, that the most valuable and useful thing that you can do from a negotiating point of view is to generate working software and then connect that working software to users, because then you're generating value. And that reminds me of one that I missed out, which is talking to the people who are going to use this system and also starting to understand the organization, the complex area, the swamp that I've talked about in other chapters, that this project is going to be delivered into, this product is going to be delivered into. And part of that is to kind of understand, and this is kind of like an under-examined area of like the idea of keeping a promise. So there may be areas of value that are not envisaged and not discussed in the kind of initial contract, in the initial commitment. And you can use those areas of value. You can use areas you find that kind of do work as a way of kind of essentially changing the dynamic of the project. You're not delivering exactly what you promised at the beginning, because that would be crazy, because what you promised at the beginning was too vague. It didn't have the detail, it didn't connect to value. But you are delivering things that are actually valuable to the organization, valuable to the people who use it, and also work for you as a supplier and the people who you're supplying the software to.